Sometimes I wonder, how did I get here? Do I have a problem? I probably do. Who do I blame? I blame my dad. That's exactly what we're talking about today. My dad, big music fan, record collector, 40 years ago till the day he died. I'm joined today on this episode, which is also an episode being recorded for the Vinyl Community Podcasts, by my good friend Sam St. John. And we're talking about generational record collecting, let's call it. The influence that those that came before us, be it our parents, be it the households we grew up in, how that shaped us as music fans and record collectors. Stay tuned. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Community Podcasts. I'm your host, Rob, from the YouTube channel Northern Revolutions. I'm joined again today by another fellow YouTube vinyl community content creator, I guess is what you would call us. But a new guest this time, my good friend, Sam St. John. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Rob.
Sam and I have collaborated on a number of things over on YouTube over the course of the last couple of years. We do a weekly live chat with our good friend Glenn Calloway, and have done a number of things together. And I invited Sam on to do an episode of the podcast with me because I think we have a number of things that we could talk about. But today, the idea was actually Sam's. We're gonna chat about what I'm calling generational record collecting. So, sort of the role that those that came before us have played in shaping our musical taste and our collecting habits and that kind of thing. So, Sam, if you for those that haven't seen you on YouTube, and by the way, we'll leave a link in the description for Sam's channel, but sort of by way of introduction, Sam is a lot more than a record collector. Sam is a music fan if I've ever met one. He plays guitar, he sings, he is an avid concert goer, and kind of a pretty big music collector. You want to take a minute or two and just sort of introduce yourself to folks and sort of paint the picture of what music means to Sam?
Yeah. So again, for those that don't know, like Rob was saying, I do have a YouTube channel that I started in the depths of COVID when we were all very bored and we're tired of talking to the same people. And I've always enjoyed talking about music with friends. I mean, the few friends that I have that actually, care at all about any kind of music collecting. And even then, not to the same extent that I do. I wanted this outlet through YouTube to talk to folks and meet people like Rob, like our friend Glenn that was mentioned earlier, and dozens others, and that's really become a prime means of me getting my 2 cents into the ring. But like Rob was kind of mentioning, I've played guitar since 2006. So for me, again, I'm 29 years old. I was in seventh grade when I first started playing. It was classical guitar in a small group of students locally from my hometown. Took guitar for 2 years, got really bored with classical guitar, moved to just playing whatever I felt like playing on my guitar. But that's the thing, I only had a nylon string up until my sophomore year of college, where I bought my Martin, which is, for anybody that sees my channel or anything, that's the guitar that I predominantly play, which it'll be 10 years old in February. And that's kind of like really where like I really got a buzz for playing music. I mean, I play gigs locally. I go to concerts as much as I can. Um, really, since 2009 was when my first concert was. It was a Gordon Lightfoot concert with my parents, and thankfully got to see Gordo a few months before he passed away.
Boy, you're lucky on
And
that one. as a Canadian, I'm sad to say I never did get to see our national treasure.
Yeah, it was a great experience. Again, both times my dad was at both shows, but music just has always played such a huge part of my life. I think music single handedly got me through. I always think of eighth grade. I transferred schools. It was a school that was a very very strict curriculum. I left everything else behind, went to this school, and it was just so difficult. And I always point to the album Traveling Wilburys Volume One as the album that got me through just intense nights of homework, laying in my bed sleepless because I was afraid that I forgot something for homework, and then putting that CD into the little boombox that I had beside my bed and just listening to Traveling Wilburys on repeat, um, got me. It gave me so much peace, and that's kind of where my musical blueprint for rock and roll was really cemented. I mean, I listened to other stuff like everybody else, like the Beatles, greatest hits, and Beach Boys, and I also listened to crooners that my dad liked. But the Traveling Wilburys Volume One was really the album that just expanded my full horizon to the world.
Was there an album or a song or a was there like a sort of a flashpoint moment that it just kind of opened the floodgates and you sort of dove in? I mean, I know for me there certainly was, or was it just kind of a gradual osmosis kind of thing?
It was a gradual osmosis to a point. Again, I mean, I grew up listening. My dad loved Tony Bennett and Sinatra, and so like those were on repeat all the time. My mom was kind of more into the songwriters, so like we had like Kenny Loggins was playing a lot. Like I remember like the House at Poot Corner, the Loggins and Messina tune. My parents sang to me when I was a little kid, so like I knew those types of songs. But again, other than Trevor Wilburys Volume One, the moment that I specifically remember my mind just being absolutely blown. And I mean, I know it's a podcast, but for those that don't know, I'm showing Abbey Road. Uh, when I first heard this album, the part that really just blew my mind, and I've talked about it a lot, is during the Carry That Weight portion of the medley where Paul goes back to You Never Give Me Your Money. I had never heard that in an album where a theme was brought back into the fold. And so I remember sitting in my floor again. It was one of the 2009 George Martin remixes. I listened to it and I thought, "Good grief, I've never heard anything like that before." And that was the moment where I was like, "I need to get everything that the Beatles did." I bought all of those 2009 reissues for the Beatles. I had the Beatles Rock Band, which was another huge factor for me getting into the deep cuts of the Beatles. So that was like the moment. Again, it got me into the Beatles. Again, I knew about the Beatles. I had Beatles One. That was a huge album for me growing up from 1999, I think, or 2000. But from that moment where I heard Abbey Road and that light, that's when it took off. And again, I could say everything has trickled from for me, the years 2008 and 2009 were like, I was 13, 14. That's when I was hit. I think that's when a lot of people are hit with that musical itch of kind of like that music that lays that cornerstone of where you're going to take off from there is when you're a young teenager.
It's appropriate that you mentioned that your aha moment was Abbey Road. This is one, and I've told this story and I'll tell it again because I don't think I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but this is one of those instances where our music journeys, yours and mine, match up pretty succinctly. Abbey Road was the aha moment for me too, and about 14 years old. Now the
Yeah.
difference is I'm 46, you're 29. So for me, 14-year-old me was like early 90s. I don't know math wise. I think it'd be 94 ish, I guess. My dad, and we're going to talk about our dads in a moment, a little more in depth. But my dad was a big music fan, and this was right around, I guess, when CDs were really starting to, become the dominant format. And dad had just purchased some new speakers for the stereo at home, and he put on his CD copy of Abbey Road, which he'd had for a few years, but I'd never really paid attention. And I remember it like it was yesterday. Mom and I were in the kitchen doing dishes, and Dad put on Abbey Road, and for some reason, he played it quite loud because he was taking the new speakers out for a test drive, so to speak. But something about hearing it that time, I actually paid attention, and I was just enraptured by this, sonic whatever it was. And it's funny that you mentioned Carry That Weight, because I remember hearing everything, and then for some reason when Carry That Weight came on, it was just like boom, I'm all in. Like I don't know what it was about that moment. And then to your point, you started gobbling up the Beatles. Well, that's exactly what I did. I did it, 20 years, 15 years before you did, but kind of exactly the same way. So it's interesting that our musical aha moments are almost identical. That's pretty interesting to say the least. Um, you mentioned and I mentioned our fathers, and that's kind of the core of this whole discussion today. That you know we both come from you know parents who were big music fans and music collectors and that sort of thing. My dad's presence looms very large and ever present in everything musical I do, whether it's listening to records, whether it's doing this YouTube thing. There's a picture of him on my wall, and I'm looking at him as I'm talking to you. He's ever present. He's not around anymore. Died 13 years ago, quite unexpectedly, but nonetheless plays a massive role. And I assume yours does as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your dad? Sort of what was he, or maybe it was your mom, or maybe it was both. What was your parental influence, and how did that kind of shape you as a music fan, or as a collector?
Definitely both. I've got to give them both a lot of props because they both came from different worlds musically, and it's interesting. And my dad will be the first to tell you now. I mean, my dad is 60 now. Um, he'd be the first to say a lot of the music that he was kind of like, kind of thumbed his nose up at is now stuff that he likes because I reintroduced it to him.
I was going to ask you that question a little bit later on, and maybe we'll circle back to that. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
we can go back. We can go back to it. But like I said, a few minutes ago, when I was a kid growing up, Dad was all into like big bands. Like I associate big band music with summertime because we listened to big band all the time, and he had um, Tex Beneke and Artie Shaw and like Gershwin tunes and obviously like early Sinatra when he was playing with the big bands. So we listened to a lot of that. His favorite singer is Sinatra. He saw Sinatra the day after. I mean, not Sinatra. He saw Tony Bennett the day after I was born. He was supposed to go with my mom. Obviously, she was in the hospital. She had a C-section for me when I was born, and so he took one of his good buddies. She said, "Go and go see the Tony Bennett show." So he saw him locally. He ended up seeing Tony 2 or 3 times. So that's kind of the world that Dad was in. But also, I mean, Dad grew up in Southern Virginia, where I'm from. I'm in Virginia. Um, his brother was listening to stuff like the Rolling Stones and CCR and Skinner and stuff like that. Like the working man's kind of rock and roll. In the '70s. And on the other side of things, my mom worked at a summer camp for many years as a late teen and in her early 20s. So she was obviously around a lot of like the campfire kind of songs. I mean, she was listening to John Denver and John Prine, and she also was listening to Tom Petty and things like that. And she was also from college. She loved like the Bee Gees, but also liked Tom Waits. So she was listening to all this stuff that I wasn't introduced to until much later, but I didn't realize she already knew about that stuff until, I was 17, 18 years old. So both of those worlds growing up, they obviously had crossover. I mean, the Beatles, but even the Beatles, my dad was always like, he liked them up to a point. Like he loves She Loves You. He thinks Ringo's drums on She Loves You. I think that's his favorite Beatles song because of Ringo's drumming on it. And he loves it. But Dad kind of was of the mindset up until a point, up until recently, probably around the Help era. That's when Dad kind of stopped listening because
Right,
he didn't care about the psych stuff. He
right.
didn't care about Strawberry Fields. And mom, I mean, she knew the hits, but she was never really a big Beatles person. I mean, she loved James Taylor and Prine and people like that, Petty, and so those early days of listening to stuff, like John Denver's greatest hits or Frank Sinatra, that was huge for me because again, here I am, 5, 6 years old, knowing, about Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett, and uh, also hearing John Denver and stuff like that. So that was huge for me, as a little kid. And we can go into further details later, but that's kind of that basic parental groundwork when I was really young.
When I grew up, uh, music was sort of ever present in our household, and I sit and I look at my record collection, and it doesn't look too dissimilar from what our living room looked like when I was a kid. There was a big, a stereo on a big shelf, and there had to be 400 or 500 records. My collection's a little larger, but Dad probably had 400 or 500 albums back then, and his stereo, and he was always buying new stereo equipment. Like I remember his last stereo he bought in like 1995. I still use it to this day. It is my turntable's different, but I still have Dad's
Wow.
stereo. The speakers that he bought that blew my mind with Abbey Road, they're my floor speakers sitting at the other end of the room. Like so, and I have some of his albums, but music was always a thing. I don't recall mom ever being a music fan. Like she was just like whatever dad was listening to, cool. But dad, when I think of my dad, I think of music before. I mean, other than he's my dad, when I think of the thing that defines him, it was music. He was such a music fan, loved music, had a ton of records, jumped on the CD thing, in the late 80s when it was still relatively new. Went to a ton of concerts. He's a lot like Glenn in that, our friend Glenn Calloway, who has seen everybody in concert. My dad was kind of the same way. He saw a lot of people in concert that I would kill for that opportunity, but I'm
Yeah.
far too young. My dad was, I guess, kind of like your uncle in that my dad was listening to stuff like Clapton and Cream and Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac and Credence and Santana and that kind of Steppenwolf and that kind of stuff. Also, there was some jazz which I never got into, but he was like a 70s kind of rock and roll guy, born in 48, but there was never a Frank Sinatra or anything like that. It was
Mhm.
like 70s rock and roll, and that's really where my sort of foundation uh, came from, and I think really influenced what I listened to. Much like you say, the stuff that your mother listened to, knowing you as I do, is a lot of what you listen to these days. So, did would you call your mom or your dad, were they collectors, or they just music fans, and you sort of got into the, because I think there's a difference between someone who's a music fan and then someone who has a problem like us and we're collectors that have way more music than we probably should. Did they were they
Right.
were they collectors as well, or they just
No, they weren't collectors like we are, or like a lot of people that are listening to this show are. I mean, mom and dad had, when they got married. They got married in '92. They combined their vinyl and CDs. And I remember as a little kid thinking that my dad had a lot of CDs. When looking back at it, if you go, because they're all still in the basement at home at mom and dad's house, I mean, maybe 150 or so CDs. So it's not a crazy amount, compared to like what we have.
what's your collection like for those listening?
So my for those that are watching, I mean, essentially behind me, that's all my vinyl, with the exception of about 40 that are in my bedroom, which are my jazz and holiday records. I keep those in a separate bin. So I'll probably have, I don't know, 150, 200. I'd probably say closer to 200 records. And I actually today moved some space in every one of my little cubicles on my bin here. And then CDs, I definitely have a lot more. I'm getting more into vinyl now, but CDs are definitely where I have the majority of my music located, format wise. But again with mom and dad, I mean, they had records, and I remember because we had our basement flood several years ago, and a lot of the records were damaged with water, and they just smelled terrible, you know, and like they were tossed. But I mean, like mom, the stuff that she brought when they were married, she had stuff like Foreigner and 38 Special and Sticks.
Nice.
Like she was seeing like Sticks, you know, growing up when she was dating guys and going out with friends and Foreigner. And my dad was bringing like Elton John. Him and his sister, huge Elton John fans. My dad can pull up until about like the Blue Moves or even the early '80s era Elton. They could tell you like all the deep cuts, what albums they're from. I got to see Elton twice. The last time was with my dad in Charlotte, North Carolina, on his farewell tour. So that was a special moment. It was my dad's first time seeing Elton. So they didn't really have a collection, but again, a lot of the stuff that dad listened to growing up ended up staying behind at his parents' house, or just being lost in moves and that sort of thing. So they weren't collectors, but again, they enjoyed music. I know dad had all sorts of cassette tapes, because he was driving back and forth from Virginia to North Dakota when he was in the Air Force. And I remember one of the things that he listened to a lot was Born in the USA by Springsteen. He had that tape on repeat in his truck. And so he was, listening to that, pulling all nighters, getting home for family emergencies and that sort of thing. So not really collectors, but a lot of their original records are still kind of lingering at the house, at mom and dad's house, but not to the extent that we are vinyl. And we had a big stereo system, and I remember every now and then they put on a record, but it was mostly, as a little kid, cassette tapes, and then our CD player in the kitchen, which is where we listened to a lot of our music, was during supper in the kitchen.
Nice.
Yeah.
My dad definitely was a collector, as I mentioned, and I've said this on my YouTube channel before. He had, what I say, 400 or 500 records probably, and all really good stuff. And unfortunately, when he passed away in 2009, I had the unenviable task of dealing with cleaning out the house and all of that kind of stuff, and looking after my mom, who was not of sound mind at that point in time, understandably so. And my deepest regret is I kept some stuff from his collection, but damn it, I didn't keep nearly enough.
Mm,
I'm glad I didn't keep the whole thing, because I would not have listened to the whole thing. But there's stuff that I'm buying now and I go, yeah, dad had that. Dad had
yeah.
that. I kept the stuff that was really important. So I had all his Beatles records. I actually took his Beatles when I moved out, when I was in university. He let me take the Beatles records, and then when he passed away, I went through and I took, Creedence and Fleetwood Mac, and you know a bunch of other stuff. I took the stuff that was really important, but maybe I wasn't in the right frame of mind at that point either. That I wasn't
Mm,
thinking about, what should I take. But I think, and I actually think his passing, because it was such a massively traumatic experience for me, music was what got me through it. It really
yeah.
was, because it kind of helped me feel connected to him, which it still does to this day. Um, and record collecting really took off for me at that point. I I started collecting in the '90s, when no one was buying records, everyone was buying CDs, and I have a fair amount of CDs too. I probably have, I don't know, 500 600 CDs. Don't listen to them anymore. Generally, I'm not one of those snobs that's like, I don't like CDs. It's just, whatever. I've got most of it on vinyl. I have all of it digitally, so they're there or whatever. But records, vinyl was always my thing, and I started in the '90s, and I always collected. And if a new album came out in the 2000s, if an album came out and it was available on vinyl, I would get it on vinyl. It was always my preferred thing. But I definitely inherited the sort of collecting bug from dad, and it's still it's still it's still running rampant today. Which, it's, whatever, it is what it is, and it gives us something to talk about in terms of, on YouTube or whatever. Um, because your parents were music fans, was there any sort of, did they provide any kind of sort of informal guidance about how you collect records? And I mentioned this because I've had this conversation with our friend Jason Arsenault when he and I did an episode when we were talking about how he entered record collecting, and he said, he didn't have anyone, his parents weren't into it, and he started collecting, and he's like, well, maybe I'll just get one of those cheap record players and see if I like it. But then he talked himself out of it and got something a little bit better, and sort of had to educate himself. Were you the same way, or was there any sort of parental guidance there? But here's how you get a decent turntable, and this is what you're looking for, or you just figured it out yourself?
Yeah, it was a lot of self education. I mean, obviously, I had a couple of records. I think before I had a vinyl. I mean, a lot of it was mom and dad's that I would kind of practice with, because I remember one year for Christmas, I had a Crossley, the
Yep.
classic Crossley
Yep.
suitcase players under the tree, and I actually the Abbey Road album that I held up was my first record. That's the 2009 copy, and so that's the very first record that I had, and I remember listening to it on that Crossley and loving it, and thinking like, oh, this is so cool, blah blah blah. And I specifically remember over time, like different birthdays over the next 2 or 3 years, I was getting occasional records as gifts, but again, I wasn't obsessive about it. I wasn't like, oh, I want records, records, records. But I remember specifically, and I remember the record itself was the Brian Wilson album, No Peer Pressure, that came out in 2014. It's a double album. It was 180 gram vinyl. And I remember mom and dad gave me that for my birthday. And I remember specifically the first spin of that on that Crossley turntable, it skipped. And I was thinking like, that shouldn't be skipping. I was like, well, maybe it was just a fluke. And then like I moved to another song, or like I flipped because it was a 2 record set. I moved to the other record, it skipped. And I remember I also got Willie Nelson put out an album called That's Life, where he did Sinatra covers, and I had that record brand new, colored vinyl, and put it on the Crossley, and it skipped. And I was like, all right. So I started kind of doing some investigation, talked to a couple of friends, and they're like, yeah, that's not the record. That's that turntable, because over time it loses a lot of that, that stability, and you just can't rely on it. And they're like, over time it'll damage the record, especially if you start getting old records from the 60s and 70s that are antiques, for all intents and purposes they are.
Mm-hmm.
Or again, the 180 gram vinyl, which is like not meant for that kind of turntable. It's too heavy, it's too thick. And so that's when I started wanting, like, I stopped playing records on my Crossley for a while, and it hurt me because I'm like, I can't play records, and I've got all these new records that I've only spun once, if at all. And so again, mom and dad didn't know a lot about it, and actually, a buddy of the VC, George Allen, who is currently on hiatus with his channel, he sent me a turntable.
Oh,
Um,
that's nice of him.
knowing that I was in need of one. It was, an older, I think it was a Sony. It was an older like belt drive turntable. I mean, it was solid, and he shipped it at the time. I think he shipped it from Tennessee or Kentucky to Virginia, and I think something happened in shipping with it. I played it for a good bit, but it was also causing some issues, and I think it was just a spare that he had that he never used. But I think in some of the shipping, some of the banging around, because he self packed it, um, there was some skipping to it. So last Christmas, I received a Fluence turntable, and that thing has been wonderful. And that was from dad, from searching reviews and that sort of thing. Didn't ask input. He got it. He's like, this is like the top rated like mid range turntable that's out there, and he's like, I hope you like it. And it's playing beautifully, because again, the other turntable, the Sony, it was only playing in 33 RPM. The 45 mode was not great. So there were just a lot of hiccups with it, and again, I'm very appreciative of it. But that Fluence really upped the game for me, and that's when I was like, okay, now I really want to start getting into this. Again, I started collecting quite a bit. CDs, especially toward the end of COVID, like really getting into it. And then late 2021, 2022, that's when I started really going out and really doing some crate digging, keeping up with artists that were putting out, vinyl exclusives, record store day. I didn't do record store day until 2022, I think early 2022. So I've only done that for 2 or 3 times, with the Black Friday ones thrown in there. So though mom and dad were that instrumental part in getting me that Crossley and the first that Abbey Road record. It did kind of become up to me watching videos on YouTube, and I don't even like read articles. I was just kind of going by that, talking to a couple of buddies that I've met through YouTube, giving me advice, and from that point, I'm really pleased so far. For this apartment, for where I am located, I'm happy with how it sounds, and that's kind of what it comes down to. Is just if you're happy with how it sounds, it's not audiophile material like our buddy Jason, but
Yep.
it's it works for this little space that I have right now.
Well, that's all that matters. I was fortunate that I sort of had, you know, dad was my sort of Jedi master in this whole thing. Um, he sort of instilled upon me the importance of having a decent stereo. He was never an audiophile, um, and I'm certainly not. If that's what gets your motor running, hats off to you. Not my thing. But I do believe in having, something that's reasonable quality. Not to knock those suitcase style things, but they're novelty items. They're not for serious consumption. So, you got to have a decent amplifier and a decent turntable and a nice pair of speakers. And, if you hit the nail on the head, if it sounds good to you, that's all that matters. And that's what dad taught me. And I remember when I was first starting buying records, I was buying, Beatles records. And thankfully, all of mine are original first pressings, Canadian, because I'm in Canada. Because they were easy to find at the time because no one gave a damn because it was the height of the CD boom. But one thing I always remember dad telling me is just because you see it, don't necessarily buy it. Take a look at it. Take it out. Take a look at the record. Is it in reasonable condition? Because these at that time were 30-year-old records. And, we've all seen those records from the 60s. People would write their name on it because they'd take it to the party and the disc would get played and it would get tossed around. And maybe at the end of the night, it would find its way back. So they were well loved. So they don't have to be pristine, but just make sure if you're gonna buy a record that it's in good shape and that the jacket's in good shape, and just some of the basic sort of guidelines. I was quite sort of thankful for that sort of musical education. I mean, vinyl collecting in 1994 was not nearly as serious as it is now, but it was still nice to have someone that sort of steered me in the right direction of how to get the most out of the experience. And the other thing that's actually kind of funny, I remember just before I got into record collecting, my dad used to take I was collecting like baseball cards in like 1992 because I was like 12 and that was a thing. And the city that I live in, on the same weekend at the university, in the basement of the one building, they had the sports card show, and upstairs was the record show. And we would go and we'd do the baseball thing. I just want to go to the record thing for like 10 minutes. And this was like a year or two before I got into vinyl. And he used to drag me through it. I'm like, oh, I hate this. Oh, I
Yeah.
hate this. And then once I got into vinyl, then we started going to record shows together. And it was great. And what I wouldn't give to go to a record show with him now, because he
Yeah.
died just before the vinyl boom started, the vinyl resurgence, and he would have just been in his heyday. But do you, along that line, do you get to go record shopping with your dad? Is that a thing? Does he care about it to the same extent you do, or?
No, my dad's big hobby. My dad's a very avid reader, and he's a huge history buff. So like my dad, if you were to see, his nightstand, I mean, he reads 4 or 5 books at a time. Like
Wow.
I just for Christmas, like I gave him it was a book, it was a political book. I won't mention who or what it was about, but he that's what he wanted for Christmas, and he's got books, for politicians on both sides of the aisle. He loves reading just presidential autobiographies. He loves, reading things like on Winston Churchill or like Civil War battle tactics and like reading about stuff like that. And then mom's thing in terms of her deep hobbies. Mom loves to be outside I mean, she loves to do that sort of thing. She loves being with people and just going out and spending time with her old friends from high school and doing that sort of thing. Um, and I mean, mom's not really a shopper, so she doesn't really go out. Dad is definitely not a shopper. Dad's much more introverted.
All right.
I'm kind of a good mix of both of them in my personality, but
You've done some concerts with your parents, though. I think you mentioned.
I have, I've done several. So yeah, like I said, my first one was Gordon Lightfoot with both. I've seen Brian Adams with both. I'm trying to think in terms of like I've gone to I saw Jerry Seinfeld with both of them. So like they like to go out and about and do things like that. But I've also done solo shows. Like again, the second time I saw Gordo was with Dad. I saw Elton with Dad. I've seen Bob Dylan with Dad and with Mom once. So and I've seen Van Morrison. I've seen John Prine with my mom. So for whatever the whoever the artist is, I'll ask a parent like, hey, do you want to go to this? Or if it's somebody that we all like when we like my whole family one time, my mom and dad and my two sisters, one time all five of us went to go see Bob Dylan, and that was a really cool thing. One
I
of the
bet.
few concerts that we've all been to. Actually, it might be the that and Brian Wilson are the only two concerts I believe that all five members of my family went to at once. Seeing Brian Wilson on his Pet Sounds tour, which I know you saw.
I did. My mom and I went, which is interesting. My mom, I mentioned, not a big music fan, but before I was born, her and dad would go to concerts all the time. So after dad passed away, mom and I went to a number of concerts together. Brian Wilson, we saw Neil Diamond, which was awesome. Um, there's been a bunch of been many concerts with my mom, and sadly, only one with my dad, which is unfortunate. But it's a great story. Is one of his favorite bands was Fleetwood Mac, and so when they toured for the Say You Will album, which was the Rumors lineup without Christine McVie, um, I surprised my dad with tickets, and he loved it. Never seen the man so happy in my life. Um, the only time he and I ever got to go to a concert together, which is sadly unfortunate, but it is what it is. So
Yeah,
it's the cards were dealt, but at least I got to have that experience with him. So it's great that
for
you get
sure.
to do so many of those with both your parents. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
Pretty cool.
love it.
You mentioned back at the beginning how your parents' tastes sort of influenced yours, and you said that now you find some of the music you're listening to, your parents are appreciating now. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, again, I know because again I know what my parents like. So, like for example, with my mom, who again had kind of like that camp upbringing, I know that she still loves a good acoustic singer songwriter. She loves a good gravelly, rough voice. So, I got my mom into Justin Towns Earl, Steve Earle's son,
Yep.
and into Lucas Nelson,
Yep.
which is funny because my mom does not care for Willie Nelson at all. She doesn't care for his voice. She thinks he's talented, but she does not. She can't get into Willie Nelson, which is funny because Lucas sounds so similar to Willie, but the musical style is a little different than Willie. I mean, he
Right.
kind of leans more toward a rock
Right.
vein. So that sort of stuff I've got my mom into, and obviously like there are songs like I'll see like one song by an artist and I'll send it to both of them. I'll be like, y'all will like this. Like I'm a big fan of the Avett Brothers. A lot of times there'll be an Avett Brothers song or the Avett Brothers covering a song that I know that they like, and I'll send it to them individually, and they'll be like, "That's great, that's awesome." And again, I mentioned my dad who was not big into like '60s music. Like he still doesn't care for '50s music, which I like. I like doo wop and stuff,
Oh
but
yeah, me too. It's great.
he still thinks the lyrics are just a little too simplistic because again he loves the big band crooner stuff. So you're getting these songwriters like the Gershwins, Irving
Right.
Berlin, with these deep lyrics, and then you have
But the point of doo wop is not deep lyrics; it's vocal
exactly.
harmonies.
It's about the harmonies,
Yeah.
but it's just one of those things that he
Sure.
just never latched
I get it.
onto.
I get it.
But the '60s, again, with his upbringing, because he was listening, like his sisters were listening to the Beatles and Elton John and CCR into the '70s. So I think a lot of it came down to like a lot of things that were going on in his life as a little kid that he wants to kind of get away from. He kind of just avoided a lot of that stuff. But then when I really was getting into the Beatles, and they were a prime example, um, he thought they were just like a drug band, a druggy band, to an extent.
Sure.
Because I'm sure my dad will watch this.
Hi,
But
Sam's
like,
dad
hey dad, and mom, I'm sure she
and
will
mom.
too. But I remember playing the song "A Day in the Life" for dad, and he like because he was like genuinely asking about the Beatles and like what they were doing like in this recording and this sort of thing. Because at that point, again, I'm reading all the Beatle books and with the liner notes and stuff like that. And so like I was telling him about A Day in the Life and how Paul wanted the big build up with the crescendo with the orchestra and just blah blah blah. And that's become like I think that's become like a top five Beatles song for dad. When 20 years ago he never would have listened to Sergeant
Right.
Pepper ever, and I don't know that my dad's ever listened fully to Sergeant Pepper as a full album, but he's listened to a lot of those tracks. And again, getting him into stuff like the Zombies, one of my favorite bands that aren't talked about enough because they just had a small catalog, but listening to like the Zombies stuff or even like deeper cuts by like Bob Dylan because my dad liked Bob Dylan as a kid. But like getting my dad into like deeper Bob Dylan cuts or getting my mom into, you know, um, I don't even know, like some Tom Petty cuts because she kind of knew Tom Petty for his
The
hits and
hits,
a
right.
couple of cuts. But getting her into some of that and then, sharing a love of Van Morrison with her and like talking about like sending her a song now and being like, hey, I just heard this song for the first time. And she's like, oh, I forgot about that one. That's a good one. But it's like, it's not a song she would ever listen to because she doesn't have the records anymore. So stuff like that, I mean, we're always sending stuff, and even now she'll like send something. She'll be like, "This will be a good one for you to learn," or Dad will send one. This will be good for you to learn, or do you know this artist? Or like my dad will send me a CD just randomly because he thinks I would like it. So it's great to have parents that support it and
That,
get
that's
behind it.
that's something I miss because I mean I remember when I dove in, it was Beatles first, right, and it got into other stuff like the band and Fleetwood Mac and whatever. But my dad was always like, "It's great that you're listening to this, but let me introduce you to something else," and he'd give me
Mhm.
like Howlin' Wolf or whatever. That's the one that sticks in my mind. Always trying to broaden my musical horizons, and I never got to reciprocate that. And I think
Yeah.
um, what I was listening to in 2009, primarily when he passed away, would not have been stuff that he was interested in. But a lot of what I listen to now, I think he would really dig. And it's unfortunate that I don't get that opportunity to reciprocate because I wouldn't appreciate music the way that I do if it had not been for his influence. But it's great that you've got that. You mentioned that your mom and dad may watch this. Do they watch any of your YouTube stuff? Do they think, boy, this Sam's crazy with his obsessive record collection, or do they think it's a kind of a neat thing?
I think they think it's neat. I think they've kind of realized. I mean, because they'll come over here to the apartment, and say like, "Oh, you got that's a lot of records." But again, at the same time, I mean, we just had Christmas, and I got so many great you know box sets and vinyl records and
That's great.
CDs. So I mean, that's just what I like. Again, Dad has tons of books. So like we all have kind of that thing. My looking at my grandfather, Mom's dad. I mean, he's a huge gardening outdoorsy guy, so he's got like all these tools and flower pots, like just dozens of flower pots that he just has because they had flowers in them at one time and he keeps them just in case.
Right.
And it's kind of like us with vinyl records and like why it's hard to purge sometimes because
Yep.
we're like, well, just in case I want to hear this,
I might want to hear that one song that I haven't listened to in 10 years.
this one song
Yep.
from King Creole, like an Elvis soundtrack or something like
Right.
that. Like, I want to hear that,
Yep.
but at least I have it because again, I'm not a Spotify guy.
Right. Me neither. Me neither.
I'm not an iTunes guy. I was at the time when I had an iPod because everybody thought it was cool, and I thought it was cool being in middle school with earbuds. But no, I mean, I love having it here, and it brings me comfort. I mean, again,
You and me
because
both.
I'm a guy. Just I'm a single guy in this apartment. I've got this that like kind of like fuels me to to learn and to grow outside of just my day-to-day work life.
Yep.
Going into the office, this is like the thing that I use to expand my brain outside of work.
Yep.
So
Me as well. I've got a 7-year-old son, and I hope someday he takes an interest. But right now he goes, "Oh, Dad, you and your records." So
yeah, yeah.
I don't know whether the generational influence will continue, but Who knows?
Who knows?
Well, everybody, that will do it for this episode. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, everyone, for watching on YouTube, those that are. I will leave links to Sam St. John's channel on YouTube for those that want to check it out. Please do. Incredibly knowledgeable guy about a wide variety of music, and I think he's got a lot to offer. So thank you for joining me, Sam. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Rob.
All right, everybody. This has been another episode of the Vinyl Community Podcasts. Thanks for listening. Catch you on the flip side.